February 1965, Harlem, brownstone, 11:47 p.m. Malcolm X's eldest daughter, 6-year-old Attallah, is gone. Her bedroom window, partially open. Her bed, still warm. Betty Shabazz discovers the empty room, and the house erupts into silent chaos. Malcolm returns from a speaking engagement in Queens to find police scanner chatter mentioning a suspicious vehicle near Washington Heights. He doesn't call the cops. Instead, he makes a single phone call from a payphone 2 blocks away. 18 minutes later, men begin arriving at his door. By 12:17 a.m., over 500 men have assembled outside the brownstone, blocking the street, silent, armed, waiting for his word. They are an impossible mix. Former Nation of Islam members, street enforcers, community leaders, rival factions who'd sooner kill each other than cooperate. All of them answering one man's call. Malcolm stands on the stoop, a small leather address book in his hand, scanning their faces. What happened in the next 6 hours would never be written down. The world thought it knew Malcolm X in early 1965. The papers called him isolated, radical, dangerous, but alone. He'd left the Nation of Islam a year earlier, and the split had been ugly. Public accusations, death threats, his house firebombed just days before. The narrative was simple. Malcolm had burned his bridges, alienated his allies, made himself a target. But that narrative was a lie. Malcolm didn't operate in public view. He operated in networks, silent, layered, invisible to cameras and FBI surveillance. The small leather address book he carried everywhere held over 200 names. No last names, no titles, just first names, nicknames, and cryptic codes he'd memorized. Some names were circled, trusted, some were crossed out, the dead. Some were starred, dangerous but necessary. The book was his insurance policy, his mobilization tool, his silent army. And on the night of February 12th, when his daughter vanished, that book became a weapon. He'd kept two lists his entire life, people who'd kill for him and people who'd kill him. Sometimes the same names appeared on both. The address book had no organizational logic that anyone else could decipher. Pages were filled with entries like Detroit Red, a street contact from his hustling days. Brother Minister, a former NOI member still loyal. The Frenchman, origin unknown. Some names appeared multiple times across different pages, as if Malcolm was tracking their movements, their allegiances. One name showed up 7 times. Cardinal, no first name, no explanation. Just the title, written in Malcolm's tight handwriting, each entry on a different page. The system was simple. Circled names could be trusted with logistics. Crossed out names were dead or defunct. Starred names were people Malcolm would only call in emergencies. Men whose loyalty was conditional, transactional, or violent. He never wrote testimony, never left evidence. His photographic memory allowed him to operate entirely off-book when needed, reconstructing networks overnight, mobilizing without phones. The book was a map to invisible power. People who'd never met each other were connected through Malcolm's trust. And that trust could summon an army in under 20 minutes. Malcolm was in Queens, speaking to a small crowd about self-determination and international solidarity, when Betty called a neighbor. The neighbor found him. By the time he returned home at 11:30 p.m., the house was frantic but quiet. No screaming, no police cars, just Betty's controlled terror and the empty bedroom. Attallah's bed was still warm. The window was cracked open, cold February air slipping in. No forced entry, no ransom note, no signs of struggle. Malcolm's first move wasn't to call the police. It was to grab the leather address book and walk 2 blocks to a payphone. His home line was always surveilled. He knew that. He made 3 calls, each under 30 seconds. The words were coded, "The sparrow flew, need all cardinals." Within 18 minutes, the first car arrived. Then another. Then 5 more. By 12:17 a.m., over 500 men stood outside the brownstone, on the sidewalk, in the street, leaning against cars. They hadn't been told why. They hadn't asked questions. They simply came. And Malcolm hadn't explained a thing. The crowd was impossible. Former Nation of Islam members in bow ties stood next to street enforcers in leather jackets. Harlem community organizers mixed with men whose reputations were built on violence. Some were rivals, people who'd threatened each other weeks earlier. Some were strangers to one another, connected only by the fact that Malcolm had called. Witnesses later described absolute silence. No shouting, no chaos. Just 500 men waiting in the cold, breath visible in the winter air, eyes on the brownstone door. At 12:20 a.m., Malcolm emerged. He held the leather address book open, flipping through pages as he spoke. His voice was calm, direct, and carried across the street without amplification. He divided the city into sectors: Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan. Each group was assigned specific locations: known Nation of Islam safe houses, rival faction territories, bus terminals, train stations. The instructions were precise. Search quietly. No violence unless necessary. No police, no press, no bodies. One phrase he repeated to every group: bring her back safe. Nothing else matters. Percy Sutton, Malcolm's lawyer and a Harlem councilman, arrived around 12:40 a.m. He tried to urge caution, to suggest calling the authorities. Malcolm's response was blunt. This isn't politics. Sutton stepped back. Then came the strangest part. Malcolm deliberately assigned sworn enemies to the same search teams, men who wouldn't normally occupy the same block, now forced to cooperate. It was strategic. If someone in the network had taken Attallah, putting rivals together ensured no one could hide it. The teams dispersed by 12:50 a.m. The street emptied in minutes. And somewhere in the city, someone was watching this entire mobilization, taking notes, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. The first wave of searches ran from 12:45 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. The teams moved through Harlem and Washington Heights with eerie discipline. This wasn't a raid. It was a quiet inquiry, door knocks, phone calls, calm questions. Have you seen the child? Have you heard anything? No one was dragged into alleys. No windows were smashed. But the presence itself was a threat. Everyone in Harlem understood what 500 mobilized men meant. The searches focused on logical points: bus terminals where someone might flee the city, train stations, known networks that dealt in coercion and ransoms. Child abductions in 1965, Harlem were rare but not unheard of, usually tied to money, desperation, or revenge. One team, searching near 125th Street, found a witness. A taxi driver, finishing his shift, remembered picking up a fare around 10 p.m. the night before. A man in a bow tie, the uniform of the Nation of Islam, carrying a young girl. The girl was calm, not crying. The man had paid cash and asked to be dropped near an apartment complex in the Bronx. The description was specific enough to narrow the field. The searchers called it in. Within minutes, the intelligence was relayed back to Malcolm. The suspect was likely Nation of Islam. But here's the problem. 30 NOI members were actively participating in the search teams. Malcolm had left the nation a year earlier, but many members had quietly defected with him. Others still held grudges. This information meant the circle of suspects was tightening, but it was also turning inward. Someone in the network, someone close, might be responsible. The hunt was no longer external. It was personal. At 3 a.m., a report came in. Attallah had been spotted in a Bronx apartment building. The location was tied to a minor Nation of Islam official, a man known to harbor resentment toward Malcolm after the split. 50 men converged on the building within 15 minutes. Malcolm arrived personally, flanked by 4 others. The apartment door was kicked in at 3:18 a.m. Inside, nothing. The place was empty, no signs of Attallah. But there were clues: children's clothing in the wrong size, fresh cigarette butts still warm in an ashtray, evidence of a rapid exit. Someone had been there recently. The setup felt deliberate. Had this been a real hideout, hastily abandoned when the searchers got close? Or was it a plant, bait designed to waste time and resources? Malcolm stood in the center of the empty apartment, scanning the room in silence. He pulled out the leather address book and flipped to a specific page. There it was: Bronx, Cardinal 3. The entry had been crossed out just days earlier. Someone knew he'd come here. Someone had anticipated this exact move. It was misdirection. While 50 men stormed an empty apartment in the Bronx, the real location, wherever Attallah actually was, remained untouched. Malcolm realized they'd lost 2 critical hours. He called in new instructions: pull back, regroup, wait for better intelligence. The men retreated into the cold February night, but the message was clear. Whoever had taken Attallah wasn't just smart. They knew Malcolm's network, knew his methods, knew which names were in that book. And somewhere in the dark, someone was watching the chaos unfold, satisfied that their plan was working. At 4:30 a.m., a neighbor knocked on Malcolm's door. An anonymous caller had phoned her house with a message: "Tell Malcolm to check the river. She's got 90 minutes." The voice was described as calm, educated, not threatening, just factual, like delivering a weather report. Malcolm immediately redirected all search teams to the waterfront: East River, Hudson River, piers, docks, abandoned warehouses along the water. It was a logical move, but it scattered the force. Now, 500 men were spread across 15 miles of coastline, searching in the dark, racing against a ticking clock that may or may not have been real. Meanwhile, the NYPD had noticed the unusual activity. Surveillance units began following some of the search teams, trying to understand what was happening. FBI files, released years later, contain notes from that night. Subject demonstrated command structure and organizational capacity inconsistent with public reports of isolation and vulnerability. The Bureau was watching. They didn't intervene, but they were documenting everything. And then Malcolm had a realization. Whoever took Attallah wanted this mobilization to be seen. They wanted the 500 men. They wanted the FBI to watch. They wanted proof that Malcolm, supposedly isolated and weakened, could still summon an army in 30 minutes. The kidnapping wasn't about ransom. It wasn't even about Attallah, not really. It was about exposing what Malcolm had built in the shadows. It was a demonstration of power, a message to enemies and allies alike. Malcolm X was not alone. The search continued along the waterfront, but Malcolm's mind was elsewhere. He was running through the names in his book, trying to identify who would benefit from this revelation. Who needed the world to see his network? The answer would come at dawn. At 5:45 a.m., Malcolm returned home while teams continued searching the rivers. Betty was exhausted, sitting in Atallah's room, staring at the empty bed. "I already checked everything," she said quietly. But Malcolm checked again. He examined the window, the floor, the closet. Then he noticed something small. Atallah's favorite doll had been moved. It now faced the window, propped up deliberately. The doll was holding something. Malcolm reached into the doll's small dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The note was written in a child's handwriting. "I'm okay. The man has kind eyes." He showed it to Betty. She confirmed it was Atallah's handwriting. The paper stock was familiar. Standard Nation of Islam newsletter paper, the kind distributed at mosques. Malcolm sat on the edge of the bed and opened his address book. He flipped through pages, scanning his own notes. 3 entries were marked with the phrase "kind eyes" in the margins, his personal shorthand for people he'd described that way in past conversations. All 3 were former NOI security personnel. All 3 had defected with Malcolm in 1964. One name stood out: Cardinal Prime. There was no real name attached, just the title. Malcolm's notes next to the entry read, "Loyal but haunted, believes in old mission." The kidnapper wasn't an enemy. The kidnapper was a believer, someone who thought he was protecting Attallah, saving her from a threat Malcolm wasn't taking seriously enough. This changed everything. The man who took her loved Malcolm. He respected him, and that made him far more dangerous than any rival ever could be. Malcolm closed the book. He knew exactly who it was, and he knew where to find him. Malcolm identified Cardinal Prime as Thomas Hayes, a former Nation of Islam security chief who'd left with him in 1964. Hayes had been part of Malcolm's inner circle for years, trusted, disciplined, and intensely loyal. But in recent months, Hayes had become increasingly paranoid. He'd warned Malcolm repeatedly about threats to his family, urged him to move them out of New York, to go underground. When Malcolm's house was firebombed on February 14th, just 2 days after Attallah's disappearance, Hayes had warned him it was coming. Malcolm hadn't evacuated the family. He'd stayed in the house, refused to run. To Hayes, that decision was unforgivable. It was a betrayal of Malcolm's duty to protect his children. Malcolm pieced it together. Hayes hadn't kidnapped Attallah out of malice. He'd taken her to prove a point, to show Malcolm that his enemies could reach his family any time they wanted, to force Malcolm to take the threats seriously. Hayes had taken her to save her. At 6:30 a.m., Malcolm took 4 men and drove to Hayes's last known location, his sister's house in Jamaica, Queens. He didn't bring the whole network. This wasn't an arrest. This was a conversation. Hayes had left clues in the address book deliberately. He wanted Malcolm to find him. They arrived at 7:15 a.m. The small house in Jamaica, Queens had lights on in the kitchen. Malcolm walked up alone and knocked. The door opened immediately. Thomas Hayes stood there, calm, unarmed. Behind him, on the living room couch, Attallah slept peacefully under a blanket, untouched and safe. Hayes gestured for Malcolm to come inside. They sat at the kitchen table. Hayes spoke first. "I knew you'd come. Took you longer than I expected. The conversation that followed has been recounted in multiple versions, but the core exchange remains consistent. Hayes said, "They're going to kill you, Malcolm. Everyone knows it. Why do you keep your family in the fire?" Malcolm's response was steady. "Because running proves them right." Hayes shook his head. "I took her to show you something. You moved heaven and earth for her tonight. 500 men in 30 minutes. Why not before the firebomb? Why not before the threats?" There was no plan to harm Attallah. Hayes had fed her, played games with her, told her, "Daddy's coming soon." He'd known about the firebombing in advance, had tried to warn Malcolm, had been ignored. This wasn't kidnapping. It was an intervention. Hayes wasn't the enemy. He was the mirror. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "Come back with me," he said. "No consequences. We need men like you." Hayes refused. "You need men who'll tell you the truth." "I just did." He insisted Attallah had never been in danger. She'd been fed, cared for, told stories. When she woke up and saw Malcolm, she ran to him and asked, "Is Uncle Thomas in trouble?" That's when Malcolm understood. Hayes had been to the house before. The children knew him, trusted him. This wasn't a stranger abduction. It was family betrayal wrapped in loyalty. Malcolm made a call from Hayes's phone. He told the remaining searchers to stand down. Situation resolved. Go home. By 8 a.m., the 500 men had dispersed. No arrests, no police reports, no press coverage. The entire mobilization vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Malcolm made Hayes an offer. Walk away, leave New York, disappear. In exchange, no retaliation. Hayes agreed. He left the city within days. FBI surveillance logs captured none of the confrontation. Official reports only note a large gathering that dispersed peacefully. The kidnapping, for all practical purposes, never happened. But everyone in Harlem knew, and that changed everything. The morning of February 13th, Malcolm, Betty, and Attallah were home. No police report was filed. No news story ran. But the legend spread instantly. Malcolm wasn't isolated. He wasn't vulnerable. He'd summoned 500 men in under half an hour, and they'd come without question. The FBI noted the discrepancy in their files. The public image of Malcolm didn't match what they had observed. 2 weeks later, on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom. Thomas Hayes was not present. Reportedly, he'd kept his promise and left New York. But questions lingered. Did the kidnapping expose Malcolm's network? Did it make him visible to enemies who'd been watching? Some say Hayes tried to save Malcolm. Others say he painted a target on his back. The truth, like so many things, was lost with the man himself. Years later, Betty Shabazz was asked about the night 500 men came. She confirmed it happened, but refused to elaborate. "That's family business," she said. "The leather address book was never found after Malcolm's death. Some say Betty burned it. Others claim it was seized by federal agents. One witness swore Malcolm gave it to Hayes the morning of February 13th in a final gesture of trust. Hayes's whereabouts after 1965 remain unknown. Attallah. Malcolm Shabazz, who became an educator and activist before her death in 2013, rarely spoke about that night. In one interview, she said, "I remember a man with kind eyes. He told me my father was the most important man in the world. The book disappeared, the names scattered. But for 30 minutes on a cold February night, 500 men stood together because one man asked, and that power never went anywhere.